Hello, my name is Persefoni Tsaliki. I'm a professor of economics in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. And in this program, today, we'll talk about economic crisis and long-wave perspective. Well, the truth is that if we take any macroeconomic variable, for instance GDP, and we plot it through the years, we'll see that GDP is not flat, and also it doesn't have a smooth trend upwards. Instead, GDP fluctuates on a trend which is rising. This long-run perspective of a variable, which means the trend of the variable, is a topic that is dealt within the growth theories. A short-run perspective of a variable, that is, the fluctuations around its trend, is a theory of economic cycles. The long-run tendency of a variable functions, as a matter of fact, as the center of gravity for the specific variable. Now, today's lecture is devoted to crisis, cycles and crisis. What is economic crisis? You can hear many definitions. However, crisis is one thing, the interruption of the reproduction of the system. That means when we are up, we are doing well. When we are down, we are doing badly. But if this down is extremely steep, that means we have interruption of the operation of the system. There is the crisis. All of us are familiar with the Great Depression of the 30s. We have in 1929 the crash, and then we had the crisis in the 30s and in the 40s, because as a matter of fact, the Second World War, many argue is that it was the result of the Great Depression. Nevertheless, this up and down of the economic activity is not something that takes place from the Great Depression and onwards, that is less than a century. These fluctuations of economic activity are present in the capitalist system since its presence. That means from different economies, especially USA, where we have historical data, we see the following, that from 1750 that we have data, the economic activity goes up and down. Usually in the classes, in economic classes, we talk about the 20th century, and in the 20th century, we have the Great Depression in the 30s. After the Second War, we have the golden age of accumulation, which lasted from after the Second World War, 1945, for instance, on 50s for some countries, like Greece, because Greece had a civil war afterwards. So from 1945 to 50s up early 70s. Then we have a silent crisis, which is in the decades of 70s and 80s. Then we have the new golden age of accumulation. That means a recovery, a new recovery of the economic activity in the period of late 80s, early 90s, till mid-2000. And certainly, we have the first crisis of the millennium in 2007. These fluctuations in economic activity gave at the same time a rise to a different economic analysis and economic perspective. For instance, the Great Depression in the 30s questioned the market mechanism. Till that point, the mainstream economics believed that capitalism is a system of self-regulation, therefore the market mechanism can clear out any problem. And of course, the policies that were followed is leave the market alone, no state intervention. With the crisis in the 30s, we have the rise of the Keynesian economics, which argue for the state intervention. In what sense? That since the market cannot help itself, let someone who has the authority, the power, and so on to do it, to do that. And in Western democracies, that power thing is the state, the government. So, after the Second World War, where we had the triumph of Keynesian economics, and everybody during that period believed the following, that we must have a state proper intervention, correct mix of policies, fiscal or monetary, and therefore economic fluctuations are far away. We can skip them, in other words. We can solve the problem of fluctuations and crises. In the 70s and 80s, we have what we call in the literature the silent crisis. Probably you are very young, and maybe you heard about the oil crisis, the oil price crisis in 73, and so on. The real thing is that in 70s and 80s, we are in a recession period. And this recession period gave rise to reconsider Keynesian economics. In other words, Keynesian economics were blamed for the problem of the presence of the new crisis in the 70s and 80s. And new approaches to economics, which are the new neoclassical economics, came into the light. After that silent crisis, in early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, till 2007, 2008, we have a new recovery period, which is known as new golden age of accumulation, and of course, the triumph of neoliberal economics. What are these neoliberal economics? The backup of neoclassical, of mainstream economics that existed before the period of Keynes, before the Great Depression of the 30s. Now we are in the, I cannot say in the middle, I will say in the beginning of the first crisis of the millennium, as we'll say later on, as I will show you later on, which started in 2007 and goes on. The problem with economic fluctuations and cycles and so on is that, as I told you, from historical data for several economists since 1750, that is 18th century, if we plot this historical data, we'll see that in fact fluctuate. They have a trend and they fluctuate around the trend, which means the following. Since we have regular fluctuations, we have patterns. And since we have patterns, it means that there are internal forces in the operation of the system that creates these patterns. That is, there are laws of motion that exist, and as economists, since we are dealing with economic fluctuations, we have to realize, recognize, interpret, understand them. Now, here in this transparency, I have how the different schools of economic thought view the problem with the fluctuations in economic variables. According to mainstream neoclassical economics, any deviation from the trend is temporary and is caused by exogenous forces. In other words, this regularity, this pattern form that we observe are totally neglected in neoclassical economics. In Keynesian economics, they realize that deviations may be serious, and through enhancement in effective demand, the state can play a vital role in eliminating them. In other words, if we have fluctuations, these are a problem of policy. So with the proper policy, we can correct them, and therefore we can have a smooth rising way to go. New neoclassical, let's put it, sorry for this delay, for this comment. So you see, the neoclassical view was for the period before the 30s. The Keynesian view was for the period during the golden age of accumulation. The new neoclassical view is for the period after the silent depression, crisis in 70s, 80s, and the rise and the recovery period of 90s till early 2000. So according to neoclassical view, deviations from the trend are ephemeral and caused by state intervention. Therefore, a free market should be established in order to bring the economy back to equilibrium. In other words, the neoliberal policies that are followed since the 80s, Reaganomics, Thatcher policies, and so on, are within the idea of neoclassical economics, new neoclassical economics. Okay. Of course, it is another school of economic thought, which is the classical Marxian, according to which fluctuations are regular and are caused by the way the capitalist mode of production functions. That is, it is in its nature to face fluctuations. In other words, there are regular fluctuations. In classical Marxian analysis, recognize the fact that there are regular fluctuations, therefore there are patterns, therefore there are internal forces, therefore there are laws of motion, and we, as scientists, as economists, we are called to understand, to find out, understand, explain, interpret these laws of motion. Okay. There are different categories of economic fluctuations. According to Schumpeter's categorization, we have four. The kitchen or inventory or business cycle, which is 3 or 5 years, and it is related to demand fluctuation for a product. The juggler or investment cycle from 7 to 11 years, which is related to investment in equipment and machines and so on. The Kuznets or construction cycle, which is last 15 to 25 years, and it is, I mean, from the title you can understand that it is related to constructions. And we have contractive or long waves, which last 40, 45, 55, 60 years. An ideal presentation of a long wave or of any cycle is its up and down side from a trend. So the trend is the A. So we have the up side and we have the downside. According to contractive, the completion of a long wave lasts around 50 years, whereas the kitchen is 3 to 5 and so on. So within a contractive long wave, we have like 10 inventory cycles, we have like 5 investment cycles, we have like 2 construction cycles. And the moment that the first 3 coincide with the downturn of a long wave or contractive cycle, then we have a serious crisis problem. Let's see how this long wave, and I'm saying that again, the long wave perspective of economic activity is vindicated by the historical data. If you take historical data, unfortunately I couldn't find it, a proper graph to show that to you, but you may be able to do it. If you take historical data from 1800s till now, you will see that every 40, 50, 60 years, there is a completion of a cycle. The contractive cycle is there. You can see it in the data. Now, although they are there, orthodox economists, that is neoclassical economics and new neoclassical economics, deny a long wave perspective of economics. They don't recognize them, they don't see it. Of course, within them, there are several exceptions, like Schumpeter, Rostow, Madison, and so on. So, according to Schumpeter, therefore, long waves exist, and the cause for these long waves is the mass introduction of innovations. For instance, in 1880s, it was a downturn of a long wave. The mass introduction of engines, the mass introduction of transportation, the railroad and so on, was new innovations that gave an upward trend to the economic activity, which lasted till the 30s. In the 40s and 50s that we have a new uptrend of the economic activity, it was, for instance, the massive introduction of durable consumer goods. In the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, the mass introduction of innovation was related to information technology. So you see that if you take the time that the economic activity starts its upward trend, always there is some kind of massive introduction of innovations. Certainly, in all this game, the role of entrepreneur is huge for Schumpeter, and according to Schumpeter, the future of capitalism is very bad because the role of the entrepreneur is gradually not eliminated, but loses its glory. Another interpretation of long waves was given by the argument of social structure of accumulation. According to these people, the introduction of new institutions that regulate the contracts between various social groups, for instance, the state and the employers, the state and the employees, the employers and the employees. All these new institutions create in some way a framework in which development, an upward trend of economic activity can take place. When these new institutions become obsolete, because the economic life is something that changes through the time, that is dynamic process. So the institutions that have been created 30, 40 years ago were new and very innovative at that period, but they are very obsolete in this period of time. Therefore, the innovations, the institutions of the old period are now further, are now obstacles to development. Therefore, we have the downturn of the economic cycle, of the economic activity, until the point that new institutions are introduced in order to give a push to the economic activity and to go on. And a third interpretation of the long waves comes from the classical Marxian perspective of view, according to which the movement in fundamentals, and especially the movement of the rate of profit, is the way to see, understand, and interpret the long waves. As we said, economic crisis is the interruption of the normal reproduction of the economy. And the theoretical approaches to economic crisis are different according to the view that you have. Therefore, for neoclassical economics, even for new neoclassical economics, there is no problem because the system is self-regulated. How? Through the invisible hand. Therefore, no crisis. Whereas for Keynesians, again, the system is self-regulated. The only difference is that now, instead of being the invisible hand to regulate, we have the visible hand of the state now, who regulates and follows proper policy mix in order to have no crisis. There is another stream of economists who argue that capitalism is not a self-regulated system, and in fact, it is a system incapable for its continuous self-expansion. Under this, we have two, let's say, approaches. One is arguing about the incapability for the continuous self-expansion of the system that is due to exogenous factors. Within this approach, we have the underconsumption theorist. According to this underconsumption theorist, the system has the tendency to increase its productive capacity and at the same time to decrease incomes, reduce wages and so on. In other words, we have increased productive capacity, that is, we have huge products outside for selling. On the other hand, by decreasing incomes, we have fall in the demand. Therefore, we have products that cannot be sold because the incomes are not enough. How can we cope with this? If we look for external markets. What are the external markets? Those that are not capitalist markets. In this framework of analysis, we have the theories of imperialism, from Lenin, from Luxemburg, and so on. Okay, what did we did with colonization or imperialism? We try to find external markets in order to push the local, the domestic demand that was not enough because incomes were low. So when we reach a point that we have lack of the external markets, we come to crisis point. The other perspective that argues about the incapability for the continuous self-expansion of the capitalist system tries to understand the inner nature of capitalism and argues about the endogenous forces that give rise to elements that create this incapability situation. And what is this endogenous element that gives rise to this loss of motion? The long-run falling profit rate. That is, we have a profit rate that falls, and because of this long-run tendency of profit rate to fall, we have the economic activity to go up and down. Now, why do we have a falling rate of profit? There are two theories. One is the profit squeeze, which says that profit rates falls because wages increase a lot. And another argument, line of argument, who says that we have a rise in organic composition of capital, mechanization. According to Marx, the most important law of political economy is the long-run falling rate of profit. Let's see how profit rate falls through the years. As I said, there are two arguments. One is based on the argument about the rising organic composition of capital. The other is the profit squeeze. According to the first, the rise in the organic composition of capital, I want to clear out, because I don't want to get into details, that when we say that organic composition of capital, we mean the mechanization of the production process. In other words, a rising organic composition of capital is the mechanization of the production process. Why do we have the mechanization of the production process? Because capital is a self-expanding value. Accumulates. It is forced to accumulate, cannot survive otherwise. And in order to accumulate, in other words, to expand, comes into war, competes with others. What are the others that the capital competes? One is the workers, the other are the other capitals. In the competition that capitals have against workers, what capitalist tries to do is to reduce the per unit cost. In other words, to forces workers, has the need to force workers to work more or to work more productively, because there are certain laws about the length of the working day, about the hours and so on. The only way that is left for a capitalist to force workers to intensify the working process and to increase productivity is by introduction new techniques, new technologies, by introduction new machines into the production process. Therefore, we have the increase in mechanization. We have the increase in the capital invested. So the competition of capitalists against workers leads to mechanization of the production process. Now let's see what happens when we deal with the competition of capital against the other capitals. That takes place in the marketplace. In other words, a capitalist fights against the other capitals who come into the market to sell the same product. How the capitalist, our capitalist, can compete with the other capitals in the product market? One way is left: to reduce the per unit cost. To reduce the per unit cost in order to allow him to reduce a little bit the price of the same product in order to be more competitive and therefore to gain a market share, higher market share. We show that how he can reduce the per unit cost, which might lead to lower prices for our capitalists, we said before, through mechanization. Therefore, competition against workers and against other capitals inevitably leads to the mechanization of the production process. This increase of the mechanization in the production process means that we have more capital invested in the production process. We have higher organic composition of capital. Now, these are the results of the competition. Let's see now what happens to the profit rate. By definition, profit rate is a ratio of profits over K. The pie, the capital pie, is profit, mass of profits. The K is the capital invested, and the pie, the small, the lowercase pie, is the profit rate. We see the following, that the K, which is the capital invested, has to increase because the capital is forced to increase the mechanization of the production process, which leads to increase in the capital invested. So K over time increases. The profits, the mass of profits, the capital pie, it might increase or might stay stagnant. Why? Because of competition and in its struggle of capitalists to gain higher market shares and to survive in the market, has, we said, decreased the per unit cost, which might lead to lower profit, to lower prices, which means that it has lower profit margins. Therefore, over the long run, what we see that the mass of profits might rise a little bit, the capital invested has to rise because of the mechanization, and over the long run, the profit rate falls. Therefore, over the long run, we have the falling rate of profit, which is due to the rising organic composition of capital. Nevertheless, there is another argument, according to the profit squeeze, which profits are squeezed because wage share increases as opposed to the profit share. And this leads to falling rate of profit. Now, in what follows, I have some graphs which will help us to understand what we said about crisis and so on, in talking about a real economy. And this real economy is the Greek economy for the years 1960 to 2012. The first graph presents the mechanization of the production process. I have two measurements of the capital-labor ratio, which represents the mechanization of the production process. The first one on the top, the red one in other words, as labor has only the productive ones. I don't want to get into details, but even when I make no distinction between productive and unproductive labors, the green, the blue line and so on, I see that capital labor rises through the years. What we see about Greece is common things for any economy that you may analyze. So through the years, from 60 up to recent years, the mechanization of the production process increases. And it is a historical factor. If you take data from very old years, you'll see that the capital labor ratio increases. Therefore, it is a fact. We have the mechanization of the production process. In this graph, I have net real operating surplus, which is the above line, and so which are the profits, the mass of profits, somehow an approximation to profits. And in this, the red line is investment. As you see, from the 60s, 59, if I see from the 60s up to 74, we have increase of the profits and investment. Then we have the downturn. In the 90s, early 90s, we have the uprising thing, and certainly 2006, 5, 7, we have the dramatic decrease in these two variables. Now, we have, in this graph, we have the rise, we have the productivity and the wage. We see that over the years, productivity increased. No matter how you measure it, in productivity, in CNA terms, we take into account the distinction between productive and unproductive labor. Productivity in owner accounts, we don't take into consideration this distinction. Nevertheless, in both ways, we see that productivity increases. On the other hand, real wages, real product wages, increases, but not that much, which means that according to the profit squeeze argument, as we said before, we said that profit squeeze, according to this argument, the increase in wages is the cause for the fall in profitability. Here we see that productivity increases more than the wages, therefore we cannot attribute the fall in the profit rate that we see in this graph to the rise in wages. But instead, we can attribute that to the rising mechanization of the production process. So, here we are, and we have the rate of profit, different measurements of the rate of profit. I don't want to get into details, but as you see, for instance, in the net rate of profit with self-employment. Profit rates from the 60s follows an upward trend which goes together with the upward trend in economic activity. It is, let's say, the end of the golden accumulation period that took place after the Second World War. In 73, we start having the declining and the period of the silent crisis, which, as you can see, goes up to 1990, 86, somewhere here, we have a downfall of the rate of profit, which is very dramatic, and it is during the period of the silent period. From the 83, 84, we start having somehow an increase of the rate of profit, which lasted up to 2007, which is the new golden age of accumulation. But we have to pinpoint here that this rise is much more less than the rate of profit that was before the 70s. And then we have, in 2007, if I see, we have the dramatic downturn in the rate of profit and the crisis that we live together, all Europe, all the world, since 2007. So what we can say is that, as conclusion, is that economic crisis is a stylized and systemic element of capitalist reproduction. It is there, it is repetitive, which means that it has specific cause. And what I want to pinpoint here is that it is a different thing to talk about the cause of a crisis, and it is a different thing to talk about the source of a crisis. The cause of a crisis can be anything. For instance, in 1970s, we had the oil price crisis. In 2007, we had the financial sector crisis and so on. That was the cause. But the source of a crisis is a different story. And if we see the historical data, we'll see that the source of a crisis is always the long-run perspective of profitability. The long-wave approach, as we said, is vindicated by the historical data. So we do see that we have long waves in historical data, which means that we do have fluctuations, we have upward and downward trends, we have recoveries and recession periods. We do have crises, and as we mentioned, crisis is the dramatic or the interruption of the reproduction process. And since we said that the real source of any crisis in capitalist system is profitability, it means that the prerequisites to overcome the current crisis and any other crisis is the rise in profitability. So, how can we increase profits? Of course, if you remember, we said that the profit rate is a ratio. We have in the numerator the mass of profits, in the denominator the capital invested. One way to increase this ratio is to increase profits, the mass of profits, which is very questionable how you can do it in a period of crisis. The other way, which is usually followed during a recession period to overcome the bottom place, the bottom point, is to devalue the capital invested. In other words, to reduce the value of the K. How you can do that? Of course, through innovations. Because If we have new innovations, it means that the capital with the old technology has to be replaced. It is, in other words, devalued. It is useless. Therefore, an old machine is sold for scratch. You cannot sell it anywhere. So innovations do devalue the capital. The other way is mergers and acquisitions, profitable mergers and acquisitions. In other words, you see that there are mergers that went well and mergers that didn't go well. Those that went well is that because they got the invested capital of the enterprise in a very cheap price, in a very well priced. Therefore, the K was devalued. There are another way of increasing profitability is the privatization of state enterprises. And it is something that we have here in Greece right now. State enterprises with huge capital investment are sold very cheaply. Therefore, the people or the company that buys the state enterprise immediately reduces the K, since it pays very little. Therefore, increases the profitability of the same enterprise. And of course, the best way to increase profitability is through war. And why I'm saying through war? Because anytime that we have war, everything is destroyed and we start from the beginning. So the K vanishes. And I think I told that at the beginning of the lecture. The Second World War, it was the result of the Depression period of the 30s. So let's see what will happen next. I have here some bibliography about the crisis and so on. And once again, thank you for your time and your attention.